After e4, c6, knight c3, d5, knight f3, the Caro-Kann with the two knights is on the board, and after bishop g4 in this video, we're going to go through what happens after bishop takes knight immediately, which is one of the most popular lines. We have to attack the bishop immediately, as we've seen also in the previous videos. I think the first or second video of this series, the bishop then went back to h5, and then there's a whole lot of theory. After bishop takes, queen takes back, of course, and we're going to go through this line now, which is the most boring one, e6. So in this video, we're focusing on the most solid variation of the Caro-Kann, and so it's probably going to be a boring video and not very sharp. Let's quickly point out how the advantage that white has here is not that much in position or material or tactics or anything. Yeah, well, position is fine. I mean, we've developed two pieces, but black is a very solid center. The strength of the white player in this game consists of the bishop pair, which has been earned right from the very beginning. Black trades the bishop pair with the idea of closing the game so that the two knights would be powerful as soon as possible. Black could have played knight f6 as well. We are going to go through knight f6, but there's the thing is, it's probably going to transpose anyway. I'll show you why in a bit. So after e6, white continues with bishop to e2. Now black has to develop, so knight f6, and I mean, you've never seen knight e7 in this in the Caro-Kann. It wouldn't make sense, as that will delay the development of the dark square bishop. The dark square bishop doesn't really want to go through the fianchetto in an opening like this, because the usual squares are going to be bishop d7, d6 or e7. Knight f6 and then castles, and then the bishop develops. Bishop d6 is not good, because then we manage to open the game and our bishops are going to be much more powerful than the two knights of the black player. We're threatening e5 immediately, which means that the black player will be forced to do something about it. And so after a bunch of swaps, pawn takes, for example, knight takes, then the knight will have an attack on the bishop, which means that black cannot do the usual maneuver of knight to d7, because then the bishop will be unprotected, and the knight to d7 maneuver will be necessary to defend the knight and still have a knight in f6. Right now we're just threatening to trade everything. That's also a possibility. Knight takes, queen takes, pawn takes, and we go to the end game with the two bishops. That's an idea. So the d4 move that threatens e5 forces black to open the game, and that is the whole point. The black player decided to trade the bishop from g4 to f3 for the knight in order to close the game. So in this position, bishop to e7, developing the bishop, and white continues with d4. e6 will not be ideal in this case, because the black player can just move the knight away. And yeah, the position of the white player is still fine, but then black managed to close the game and create this sort of French structure, and that's exactly what black wanted. So we're going to look at two moves now, pawn takes and castle. So pawn takes looks like a contradiction with what I've been saying so far. Pawn takes, then the black player is opening up the game. The thing is that right now, if pawn takes, there's an attack on the pawn. So you cannot really take back, because then you just go down a pawn, you lose a central pawn, and there's no really compensation. If black plays accurate, then black is just better. So white now plays this move, queen to e3 to defend the pawn, and funny thing is, nothing stops us from taking the pawn in e4 anyway. We're going to look at two options now, knight b to d7, normal development of the knight, and knight to d5 with an attempt of creating a pawn chain in the center, and maybe try to attack the queen, win a tempo. So let's start with knight to d5 actually. After knight to d5, now we have to take the pawn in e4 with the queen, of course. Taking the knight in c3 will just be nice, because then we get to open this pawn that will allow our bishop to have two possible diagonals to get out from. So if that happens, then good on white. After knight b to d7, potentially reaching f6, white's best move is to take the knight in d5. And after pawn takes back, of course the c pawn makes much more sense. Queen to g4, targeting g7, and after castling and bishop to h6, obviously going for checkmate, bishop to f6, defending the checkmate, white simply plays c3, and this position is favorable for white. We have the bishop pair, and we've managed to open up the game enough. We will look at two options, and then we're going to go back to look at other options from the previous situations. e5 seems to be making sense. The knight wants to go to e5 potentially. And rook to e8, another developing move, getting the rook out of the annoying pin of the pawn, so the black potentially may think of playing g6 later. So let's start with rook to e8. White continues with rook a to e1, finishing development. And after e5, which has to come anyway, like there was no way to not make it happen. Black gets Black gifts a lot of tempos to white if he were to play a move like queen to b6 instead of e5, queen to b6 with an idea of attacking this pawn, something like that. Then white plays bishop to c1, and what have we achieved by going to h6 and then coming back to c1? Well, the queen is no longer there, and so we're winning a tempo. What happens now is if black plays any silly move, like whatever move, like rook to c8, white wins tempos by playing h4 and the inevitable h5 and so on. And any good player here will be recognizing that white is winning crucial tempos. Even if black plays queen to a5, starting going for this pawn, trying to go for some material advantage, then he's not realizing the danger of playing h4 right now. This queen is just too well placed. So back in this position, after e5, white continues with bishop to b5, and white is just better. There's double attack on the knight. The knight can't really move without black losing the exchange. And so white's just winning here, because even if rook e7 protecting the knight, then bishop takes, queen takes, and then swapping everything, and then we can take the pawn in e5. And even after bishop takes, rook takes, and then black wins the bishop back, white now plays rook to d1 and wins the endgame. Black has two isolated pawn and a double pawn here, so it's not going to be a problem. Back at this position, earlier we went through what happens after rook e8 and then e5 and everything. What happens if black plays e5 immediately? We played the same plan, which is bishop to b5, double attack on the knight, except that this time the knight can actually move because there's no pin. After knight to b6, for instance, white can continue by taking the pawn in e5. After bishop takes, rook f to e1, placing the rook on the open file. Black gets too passive after simply playing the bishop back to f6, because then he will have to admit losing two tempos. And then after rook a to d1, white's position is just better. White has a plan of simply playing solid and exploit the weak isolated pawn of the black player and go for an open endgame. There's going to be just way too many potential moves here, so it's impossible for me to go through them. So yeah, that's the idea. Black's most passive reply is this one. What happens if black plays this move, which is the most active and also the one I've personally encountered a lot? Queen to f6, developing the queen, putting more defense over g7, defending the bishop from the rook, and allowing black to connect the rooks, so it looks like the better move. White can now trade everything off to an endgame, play bishop to g7 with an attack on the queen, queen takes, and now rook takes the bishop, exploiting the fact that the black queen is pinned. So after queen takes queen, also because of the threat of rook g5, and anyway we're threatening to trade, we're happy about that. So after queen takes, pawn takes back, we've doubled the pawn, but we're going in an endgame against an isolated pawn with the bishop against the knight. a6 is met by rook to g5 check, king to h8, and now the bishop goes back to e2. The idea is to go to f3 and start putting pressure on the isolated pawn. Let's just play a bunch of potential moves that could happen now, the best moves actually, and see how white should be playing this endgame. Rook a to d8, bishop to f3, starting to put pressure, and after rook to d6, there's two defenders over this pawn. The idea is maybe to double up again. White continues with rook to e1, ready to play the rook to the 7th rank. And after black best move, which is rook to e6, we really can't ignore this because the rook's attacking the rook, so we can't really go for the pawn. We have to play rook to d1 now, and now we have finalized the pressure over d5. And this wasn't really avoidable, because even if black hadn't tried the rook to e6, we're still threatening to go to the 7th rank. So either one thing or another, we're going to be seizing control. So after rook e6, rook to d1, rook back to d6, we still can't really take the pawn because it's defended by a knight, and if we take it with a bishop, then we're gonna get too much attack after the rook goes to d8. Is not a pleasant position, so white continues with rook to d4 and simply gets the king ready to join the game. After rook f to d8, king f1, and this knight can't really operate by going to c4 or something, because then he will lose control over d5, white will win material, and the bishop against the knight in this open endgame should be easy for white to win. After the best move, f6, rook to h5, and king to g7. White opens up the double pawn, and he's happy to trade and expose the black king a little bit more. Yeah, computer evaluates this as a completely winning endgame, and it's not really difficult to see why. Black's best move is to take, and then rook takes back with a check. We're gonna end the line here. It's just a super pleasant position for white to play. This leads us to recap. So the two knights, Caro-Kann, bishop g4, we attack the bishop, bishop takes, queen takes, and e6, bishop e2, and knight f6 that comes anyway. Castle, and bishop e7, d4, and we're quickly gonna go through this again. Pawn takes, the queen's attacking the pawn d4, so we're gonna play queen e3. Earlier, as I said, we're gonna have two options: knight to d5 or knight b to d7, the normal development. So we went through knight d5. This time we're gonna go through knight to d7, which cannot transpose because earlier we went through knight d5 and then the queen took the pawn. In this case, we're gonna take the pawn with the knight, and this looks like weird because this allows the black player to play knight to e4, as I said before, then queen takes back, knight f6 coming with a tempo. So after knight takes, queen takes, knight f6, white plays queen to f4. In this case, this happened because black played the most solid reply, and we couldn't really avoid it. However, we are happy with this situation. We've got the bishop pair, the center is quite open, so we're going to continue. Black castles, and now white plays the crucial a4. Idea is to put more pressure over the square b5 and prevent any sort of attack on the queen side, and especially white now is simply expanding on the queen side. How do we meet this move? Knight to d5 now, queen to g3. So we're going to have these usual two bishops attacking like this and the queen attacking on the king side. If bishop d6 attacking the queen, again, white continues with queen to f3. And yeah, this is why this video is definitely not the sharpest, not the most entertaining of all the many that I've done so far. It's because it's the Caro-Kann. It's a very boring and solid setup. So the advantage, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, consists of simply having the bishop pair. So what happens now? Well, plenty of things can happen. We're going to look specifically at one idea, f5. The black player wants to, since the game is open, he wants to quickly get the queen out and the rook, double up the rooks, and play active. You can't really play that boring and solid this endgame because we still have queens on the board and white has the bishop pair. So after f5 and rook to d1, queen goes to f6. White's best move now is c4, with expanding on the queen side already, which means, well, knight b6 will be met by a fork. Knight c7, for example, will give birth to one of those scenarios where you can just play c5 attacking the bishop, b4 as well, and then you're gonna keep pushing and potentially produce a passed pawn later on. White is winning too many tempos. So after knight to b4, this is the idea we're gonna look at. c5 comes. This is thematic against the Caro-Kann. After c5 and bishop to c7, putting more defense over the squares of the queen side because that's where we're gonna be pushing anyway. White continues with queen to b3 attacking knight and also making a skewer, so we're going to be taking the pawn in b7. And there's no counter action, so knight d5, we take the pawn. We're also attacking this pawn over here and the bishop, so the knight can't really move without black losing the bishop. And so white is completely winning. So in this position, after a5 protecting the knight, white continues with bishop to d2, putting more attack over the knight. And white's expansion on the queen side becomes inevitable. We are going to be winning material. And by the way, this pawn in d4 can't be taken because of bishop c3 attacking the queen, and after queen moves away, has got to move away from the bishop and from the rook. So after queen to h4, queen a6 check, king moves, and then rook to d7. White proves that the pawn in d4 was incredibly poisoned. White's threatening a deadly attack on g7, so even after rook to g8, we could just ignore this bishop and play queen to f7. The idea now is we have too much attack on g7. And even after queen to h6, protecting everything, then we can just win material. So quickly, one more recap. Bishop g4, we attack it. Bishop f3, we take it. e6, bishop e2, and knight f6. This is this incredibly annoying and boring opening. White now castles. Bishop e7. a d4. So we said we have two options: pawn takes or black simply castles and keeps the center close. We went through pawn takes and all the things that happen next. So what happens after black castles? Of course, we don't close the game by playing e5. We might play e5 later on, but it depends on what black does. White's best move now is rook to d1, putting the rook on the same file of the opponent queen. And after knight b to d7, carrying on with the usual moves, the usual development moves of the black's Caro-Kann, but this time without opening the center. White plays a4 anyway, so that's thematic, and it's crucial because of all the pressure that we're applying over b5. So that's for the expansion. A move like c5 here not only cannot be played, should not be played by black because it helps us to open the game, which is what black doesn't want, but also because then the pawn in d5 will have too much attack. Same goes for the pawn in e5. We're still gonna just take in d5, win material. So let's look at this plan this time. Knight takes in e4. In this case, it's slightly different. Yeah, we still have to take, pawn takes, and queen takes. And now black plays knight to f6. The difference is that now we don't have to go to f4 to keep protecting the pawn in d4 because it's already protected. So we can already go to f3 as we eventually ended up in the previous line. After knight to d5, white plays the thematic c4. And this is one of those positions where black doesn't really have any strong move at all. So why knight d5? Well, there's really nothing else that black can do. Like knight d5 is an idea. Black could have played something else. But white is the reason why this opening, this specific Caro-Kann, is played at like a lot of levels, even up to like players rated 2000 or something like that. But it's never played at the super grandmaster level or something. It's because it gives you nothing. The black player just hopes to go into an endgame that he has already seen and experimented many times, and try to win there. But there is nothing. White has the bishop pair, and look, what can black do? Whatever black does, like h6 for example, h6 is around 95. White's still gonna play a5, a6, messing up with this pawn structure, exploiting the pressure over c6. The pawn in b5 will never be able to push because there's too much attack. If instead of h6, like something like a5, trying to somewhat stop the expansion on the queen side, then again nothing really happens. The black player can never push b5. The knight in d5 will always be met by the thematic c4, and then the queen can go to b3, targeting the weakest pawn in b7. This is a pattern that has to be remembered. White in this case will continue with moves like g3 to get the king to go to g2. Eventually, black doesn't have the light square bishop and play queen to b3 anyway. Instead, we can look at this other idea. Queen to d5, going for a swap, is met by queen to g3. We like it that the knight can't go to h5 with an attack on the queen because of the bishop. And after bishop to d6 attacking the queen, white can play queen to e3, hanging around these squares forever. These squares are all going to be squares where the white queen will go to and never really be in trouble. And also the black player has no really a chance to start pushing pawns without losing them. Yeah, the advantage isn't huge, but it's an open-end game. You got the bishop pair. You've survived the Caro-Kann bishop takes f3 variation all the way so far, and went to a favorable endgame. So let's keep looking at this line that I was going through before, so we can close this video. After knight to d5, we can play the thematic c4, and after knight to b4, the usual 3 comes. In this case, though, the black player still has an eye on the knight. So after a5, a move to stop queen b7. Then black still has defense over the knight, so we can't really play the bishop d2 move. I mean, it's not the best move. The best move now is bishop to f3. And we're threatening to swap everything and then just go with the rook all the way to the 7th rank. So after queen to c7, preparing the connection of the rooks and conquering the open file with the rook, future open file. Bishop to e3, finishing development. Rook a to d8 and rook a to c1. White's plan now is simply to wait and improve the position on the king side as well. If white were to play again now, moves like g3, h4 and king g2 will come. Again, this king is super safe in here. There's no light square bishop for the black player. And white is just waiting for black to push any of the pawns so he can take the upper hand. So it's black to move. Let's make an example. c5 to try and break the center is met by pawn to d5. And again, we're just leaving it like that. We don't move anything, we just wait for black to make a move. and so it's like some sort of Zugzwang already. G3, King G2 can come anytime and just slowly improve our position while black runs out of moves. If pawn were to take, then we will just take back. We have a pass pawn. Yeah, it is kind of difficult for this pawn to make it at the moment, but that's going to be our strength. So let's close this video by showing a few endgames that have happened to go through and how they had to be played, how they should have been played. So after black played a move like b6 now, white continues with g3. We're just waiting and improving the position slowly. After g6, both preparing either the bishop to go back to a fianchetto situation of maybe the king to g7, getting ready for the endgame. White continues with rook to d2, preparing to double up. Either this, well, this way not possible at the moment until the knight moves, or maybe rook to d1. And after rook f to e8, white continues with bishop for attacking the queen. Bishop to d6 is met by bishop to h6. So this is thematic, which is controlling all the squares near the king. Right now, the sacrifice in g3 doesn't work. Bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, and then rook simply to g2. After bishop goes back to f8, for instance, the black player will be super happy to trade one of the bishops. Bishop goes to g5. And now white will continue the game like this. It's just a better situation. White's attacking the rook and has a dominant position and a pass pawn.